As intuitive sensitive people, we all at some point or another suffer from this condition almost of feeling never good enough. So we feel it in our lives, either in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in life in general. We never quite feel as though we live up to an expectation, whether that is real or imagined. I'm Heidi Sawyer. Thank you for joining me for this masterclass. I'm your host for the upcoming webinar, How to Kindly Say No and Get Away Without Feeling Wounded, Damaged or Shouted At. So this is a short pre-video to that webinar to help you see that that feeling of never good enough, never living up to some kind of expectation is not actually your problem, that it is something that perhaps is part of your life prior to you even coming into this world. So just to give you a foundation of what people with, I never feel quite good enough, actually experience or go through in terms of their emotions. So those who worry about whether they're good enough absolutely show to the outside world a glossy picture almost, that everything is fine, and when you ask that question, oh, how are you? Oh, yes, fine. You never say anything other than that everything is fine, because you don't want to have an impact on anybody else. You don't want to inconvenience anybody. So you are exceptionally good at pleasing people and conforming with a smile. Oh, yeah, absolutely fine. You'll also find that in many instances that you overachieve, whether that is in things that you have to do or in work situations. So you do a lot of overgiving. And you're clever at the appearance of, yep, everything's fine, everything's all hunky-dory. But inside, you'll find that you're feeling sometimes quite a lot of emotional pain, feeling misunderstood or not very understood, or that no one really knows how to connect with you. So there's emotional pain and a tension, and sometimes that tension comes out in the body grumbling at you. You also may find that you go through periods of time or periods in your life where fatigue is a strong thing that you have to deal with. You may also find that you're really quite hypervigilant to your environment, and at the same time feeling that you don't always find it easy to trust yourself or your own decisions, and mostly whether you actually feel comfortable with trusting others. It's something that you're constantly testing out and feeling the sense of distrust before you can trust. You also feel that a strong feeling, or a fear rather, of getting it wrong. So your coping style will be to be approving, to do whatever it is that you feel that you need to do to be approved of. You may also find that absolutely you were the model child. You were so well behaved and very good. You did everything that was along the lines of you were a good child. So within that circumstance, feelings become something that you are numb to, because you have to put on this persona that everything is fine and dandy. So rather than feeling or acknowledging or allowing anyone to notice that there are feelings of pain, that you're not good enough to have them, you numb them out. So all feelings become something that you numb. So the child self believes that all feelings should be met with disapproval. So you'll therefore interpret any feelings as bad, wrong or scary. So the foundation feels that, yep, not good enough. So where does this all come from? So how are we influenced by all of this? And why, if you've had a kind of fantastic foundation, why are you traipsing around with the feeling of, well, I just don't feel I can ever live up to an expectation? It's history. Our physical and emotional history is inherited through our parental line. Okay, so we obviously know our physical history is, but it's not until these very recent times that is there an acceptance that our emotional history, regardless of behavior that's happened around us, that in actual fact we inherit components of our family's emotional history through the generations. So what does that mean? It means that we carry all kinds of things, including fear, from our ancestors, and we program our life accordingly, even if it's not relevant today. So how does this happen? Well, if we look at it along the lines of energetic memory that's stored in your system, and how you deal with such things as power struggles. So what name is this given? Well, if you look at it from the basis of the fairly new, or actually very new science of behavioral epigenetics, it's an emerging area of looking at how nurture shapes nature, rather than what we're used to looking at that subject area the other way around, is how nature shapes nurture. So how nurture shapes nature, how it can actually change the foundation of who we are, is looked at in terms of gene expression that is influenced by experiences, so life experiences and the environment, rather than just something that's physical that happens through the generations. So if we look at it along the lines that if behavioral epigenetics are true, which is how nurture influences nature, if our genes are altered through ancestral habits, so some of those things that have impacted our ancestors, it makes sense as to why we, as intuitive sensitives, at some stage in our development, and for you that stage is now, otherwise you certainly wouldn't be listening to me, is that we then seek to tidy parts that we didn't even know that we had. And those are our ancestral lines. And that shows in the feeling that never quite feeling good enough, or that we feel that we need to solve it. So this is about solving the emotional passing from one generation to another, because 9 times out of 10, what was relevant to our ancestors isn't actually relevant to our life moving forward. And in actual fact, it's so irrelevant to our life moving forward, it becomes something that's paralyzing in allowing you to move forward. If you feel stuck at the moment, and you feel that no matter what you do, it doesn't seem to shift, I can pretty much say that if I was to keep asking you questions, it would come down to, well, I don't feel good enough. And why? Well, I don't know why I don't feel good enough. It doesn't make sense. Well, what I'm saying to you right now is it makes sense, as in some of these things, some of this unconscious component is passed down the line, and something that you have gathered as information about yourself as far as your ancestors are concerned. So as an example, danger signals that were relevant, let's say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, are lived out in the generations further down the line. So some of those things that impacted those people then are impacting you now, even though they're not relevant. So our pre-life energetic influences, research shows that there are possible significant changes occurring in the DNA. So when your ancestors had an emotional experience, or let's say a traumatic experience, it stuck in there to the extent that it impacted the DNA of generations moving forward. This is how this science of behavioral epigenetics is showing us that this is to be true. Now, you may have felt that that's true, but you've never really had a way of understanding that it is true. So those psychological adjustments that may have happened through trauma for earlier generations are impacting you now. And that means that first, second, third generational babies are born with a right hemisphere preference. Now, why would they be born with a right hemisphere preference? Well, what does that mean? A right hemisphere preference doesn't mean that you are right-brained. It means that you have a preference for the right hemisphere. Why? Because the nervous system is developed through the right hemisphere, and therefore it means that to a certain degree that you were either born in a time of stress, or that there has been stress through the generations. So if we look at it along the lines of first, second, third generations born into that kind of stress, we can even look at it in recent history. So that hypervigilance, that needing to be aware always of your environment, would certainly have impacted us at some stage or another, and maybe more than most, because we are intuitive sensitives. So how does that shape? Well, as an example, war. And at some level or another, we are all products of war at some point through the generations. And certainly in this part of the world, we're very much aware of the influences of the First and the Second World War. It's something that is kind of programmed into our awareness at some level or another. So war babies, post-war babies, as an example, were born into a time of stress. And so that would mean that they were already pre-programmed for a more delicate nervous system, to be more aware of what's happening around them, what's happening in their environment, and whether that's something that they are conscious of or unconscious of, it has an impact. So therefore, it creates a conflict within our own inner selves for us as intuitive sensitives. So we do have that heritage at some level. Our right hemisphere preference needs, so our right brain preference needs a wider settings. So it means that having the energy of never quite feeling good enough doesn't actually serve us, because we need this sort of wider settings of the ability to feel freedom, to feel that we are free to change our minds, free to do something differently, free to expand, free to be more creative. But this pre-generational energy of that we have to be cautious, that we're not allowed, that we can't, that it's dangerous, which is obviously, was something that was very real, means that we have an inner conflict between, are we allowed this more expansive thinking, or do we have to go with what we know? And so every time we then try and move towards this more expansive area of who we are, we feel this massive level of restriction. There's something inside us that shuts down, says, no, you're not good enough to do that. You're not allowed to. And that is exaggerated by the fact that we are programmed in society at the present time to accept that more of a left hemisphere logic, which is understand that there is a cause, there is an effect, and there is something to fix it. And so we in our inner world become very confused by these two areas of, do we push towards, or do we move inward towards what is safe? And every time we feel that inner push towards our own expansion, we feel, no, can't do that. There's this resistance. We don't understand it. And when we feel we're not good enough. So as an example, baby boomers, so those born from a time period from 1946 onwards, carry the authority residue which is associated with war. That's got an inevitability about it. It is that, what does war bring in? Well, war brings in the energy of, you have to be more careful, you have to be more cautious, you have to be frightened, you have to be, that life is traumatic. And we carry that energy moving forward. And there's a whole mass of people carrying that frequency still, because they were born into that, but also that it's the danger signals carried from their own ancestors, and it was a very real one. So how does that interpret in life? Well, it becomes then that everything is about an external authority rather than our own authority, that we have to bow down to something that is external in terms of authority. And sometimes for some people that also means a level of brutality experienced from, whether it's emotional or physical brutality, from a very early stage in life. So the dilemma is the freedom of now. So we have this drive, this need to create this freedom of now. And that, for an intuitive sensitive, someone with that really quite strong, or very strong, right hemisphere preference, needs wider space, need wider thinking space, need sometimes quite often wider physical space, and can't deal with that that sense of being hemmed in or restricted. Now the issue is, we want that, but we're programmed to through the cross-generational fear of authority at various different levels. As I explained, post-war, pre-war, scenarios through war, it's that everything external to us is the authority rather than ourselves. Now, as we move forward in life, that is needing to change. But that external rather than internal authority, what does it do? It creates a feeling of never being good enough. Makes us feel that whatever we do, we're never quite good enough. We're not sure what expectation we're supposed to be living up to, but we're not sure. All we know is that we don't live up to it. And we then experience life without a formula, a way of solving it. So solving it, what happens with that? Well, solving it comes with the right hemisphere focus for cross-generational healing. So how do we look at that? Well, we look at that from the perspective of what works for us as a right hemisphere focus. So rather than a cause-effect fix, we're looking at what is that wider expansion that we need to allow for ourselves so that we can let go enough to actually, yes, we are good enough exactly the way that we are and exactly the way that we want to do things in terms of that expansion. We don't have to rely on these often irrelevant or outdated modes of self-protection, but we don't even know where they came from. So that right hemisphere focus for cross-generational healing means that we have to do it, to work through it in a way that is not logical. That's almost illogical because it's a way of looking at it from our unconscious view, or mostly unconscious view. And how do we access that? We access that through a deeper way of exploration. And that is not explored through reasoning, it is explored through what works for an intuitive sensitive person, which is that connection to energy, to some aspects of deeper sets of awareness, and some of those really strong aha energies that come up within us that we don't necessarily understand, but then we interpret perfectly as a ways and means of moving forward. Now, people, in my experience, who have a right hemisphere focus and right hemisphere preference move on and solve and heal things much quicker than the average person. But the issue is always trying to access exactly what it is in a way that works for you, because the logical process doesn't work. It doesn't feel like it gives you that depth of connection that you need in order to solve it and move forward. So the right hemisphere focus for cross-generational healing is a deeper view, but it's a deeper view in looking at things in terms of how that energy manifests in you now. So it's about it's a fast and quick way of looking at how that happens. Partly that is in terms of expanding our intuitive sensitivity. So the starting point for you in terms of healing never good enough, I will be covering as an intuitive sensitive, I will be covering in the upcoming webinar how to kindly say no and get away without feeling wounded, damaged or shouted at. Now this is something that all intuitive sensitives worry about, is that if you stand up for yourself that somehow or another, or it has been your reality, that you've then spoken up and felt wounded by someone else's actions or reactions, or felt that you've never recovered from something, or the bad thing that can happen to you is to feel shouted at. It's not something that sits with you very well, and it's something that stays with you for a very long time. So this upcoming webinar, how to kindly say no and get away without feeling wounded, damaged or shouted at, is your starting point most certainly in healing that energy of never quite feel good enough. So I look forward to seeing you for this exciting webinar training session. Bye for now.